Well, welcome to the Eyes on Jesus podcast with Drew and Tim. This is Tim, my co-host Drew. What's up, Drew?
Hey, what's going on, everybody?
Well, welcome back or welcome for the first time. So we are here in an introduction episode to a new vision we have for this podcast. And we're going to share with you on this first episode a little bit about who we are, first of all, and then a little bit about why we are doing this kind of new format and what our vision is and why you should come alongside us as we go down this journey. And so I'm going to start just by, first of all, welcome again, Drew. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. I'm doing so good. I'm so excited about this.
Right,
Like
me
really,
too.
like this partnership is so cool, and how it came together and how me and you have just been able to continue to really have this vision of not just keeping our eyes on Jesus in our own life, but bringing other people in on that. Just really pumped up, man.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like here we've talked about it for so long now. It seems like, but it's only been a few months, and now here we are doing it. It's exciting.
Yeah.
And for anyone listening, like we just want you to come alongside us. We want this to be something that you enjoy listening to, that is encouraging to you, that is something that you can turn on for half an hour to an hour and just be like, hey, this is that jolt of, focus that I need to keep my eyes on Jesus. And so before we go there, we want to tell you just who we are, because a big part of podcasting is buying into who is talking. And so if you don't really know much about us, then you may not really care what we have to say. And that's fine too, if you turn this off. But at the same time, we want you to care. And so we'll just do quick introductions of who we are and kind of how we got to this point. And so I'll start and hand it over to you, Drew. But
Awesome.
So my name's Tim Ferrara. I'm currently an executive pastor at Life Point Church in Santan Valley, Arizona. I have grown up as a pastor's kid, notorious pastor's kid. My wife is a pastor's kid too. And so, yeah, all the rumors are true. Not really, but so I've been married 17 years. I have two kids, 14. My son is 14. My daughter's 9. And so for most of my life, I've been working in business management in retail. And starting in 2018, I started to get a vision for full-time ministry, not really knowing what that looked like. I turned it over to God. He had me start a website called Discerning Dad. I started blogging, started podcasting at that point, and wrote a couple books. And before you know it, here I am today as a pastor. And so there was a long process I can share later, but just God calling me out of retail into being a full-time pastor, something I never thought I'd do. But by the grace of God, a lot of the skills and abilities that I've been learning in the business world, I've been able to use at church as an executive pastor, which a lot of people don't know what executive pastor does. And it's basically like I call it like the chief operating officer. If the senior pastor is like a chief executive officer, the executive pastor is the one that does all the stuff that senior pastor doesn't want to do, including vendor relationships, finances, social media, whatever, keeps
Including
the business
everything.
going.
Right.
Yeah. And so I'm blessed to be able to do that now. The funny story with me is I was actually going to quit social media in 2018, and God was calling me back into it. And so I learned so much about social media, more than I kind of want to know today. And so, but I've been able to use it hopefully, for good, with not only my own ministry and podcast, but also with the church I'm at. And so that's really where I'm at today. I did podcast for 2 years up to this point with the Eyes on Jesus podcast, which was interview based, and we'll kind of talk about what the changes look like for us going forward. But that's pretty much me. And yeah, I'll turn it over to you, Drew.
That's awesome. I actually didn't know the part about 2018. You were thinking about getting off of social media and like removing yourself. Well, I'm so glad that you didn't do that because I know everybody really, I mean, even just me personally, like so encouraged by your tweets, by your Facebook posts, by what you put on Instagram. Like all of your content is such an encouragement to us. And I'm just glad that this partnership worked out. So again, my name is Drew, and I'm a pastor's kid as well. I heard a couple weeks ago this pastor kid say, I'm a preacher's kid, and so that I didn't choose this life chose me, and that's very much my story. Grew up a pastor's kid, didn't really want to stick around in church. I used to call the worship leader at our church a Sunday sensation. And I was like, I never want to be a Sunday sensation, and over time and over God just putting, thankfully, some difficult situations in my life, but also putting some great people around me to mentor me and to help me grow and help me really understand my identity in Christ. Through that, came back to the church and started serving and met my wife. which we will be celebrating 10 years next month, which is really exciting. And rededicated my life to Christ. But I really believe finally took on faith as my own, and really decided that this wasn't just going to be something I believe, but something I follow and I'm really obedient in, which is always a challenge. And that has led to me working and serving some great churches along the way. Started at a church of about 18 to 20,000 people, then dropped to a church that I started with 9 people that in the Charlotte, North Carolina area. And that has led to a lot of different opportunities, and I'm thankful for all of them. But it's taught me a lot. It's taught me a lot about leadership, taught me a lot about God, taught me a lot about what church and ministry can be, and sometimes what it shouldn't be. And it's just been great to grow in all of that. Like I said, about to celebrate 10 years with my wife. We have 2 kids, Rylan and Levi. Rylan is 5-year-old daughter. Levi's 2.5-year-old boy. And our household is a wonderful, wonderful, chaotic mess. And we're enjoying every minute of it. But ultimately, really thankful that we got connected on this podcast. And Tim, like you were saying a minute ago, really the goal of this is just that people would join us in the conversation. We of course want them to value spending time with us, and we want them to know who we are, and we want to know, or we want them to know our background and where this content's coming from, which is not just life experience, but what we really feel like God has called us into and ordained us into. But ultimately, getting people involved in community and joining in the conversation and being a thought-provoking podcast that ultimately, like you said, keeps people's eyes on Jesus throughout the busyness of their schedule. I think that is such a great mission, such a great vision for this podcast. And I'm thankful to be a part of it and excited to get to it, man. It's going to be awesome.
Yeah. Now, it's funny because after podcasting for 2 years myself, I came into a season where I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. And so last year I stopped at season 3 of the podcast, and I just kind of gave it to God. I was like, if this is the end of me podcasting, that's fine. If there's something, if you want me to do a season 4, if there's something different you want me to do, God, like, make that clear. And so I really just spent most of the holiday season 2022 not thinking about it too much, just focusing on other stuff, kind of being glad to not podcast for a while, because the grind of 2 years straight was pretty significant. And what I did before was interview based, as you were on the podcast, and I've been on your podcast. And so that's kind of how we met. But interview based podcasts are great. And I got to talk to a lot of awesome people. I mean, just the names were mind boggling. That first of all, they wanted to come on first of all. And then Bob Goff and Max Lucado and Corey Russell, and just some amazing people I got to talk to. But that's a grueling thing week after week to talk to people, because you got to talk about, what works for them, what's a good schedule for them, to figure out, plan ahead of questions that kind of cater to what their focus is. A lot of times, for especially the bigger names, they're trying to promote a book. So you got to read up on the book. Most of the times I couldn't actually read the book. I would just get a few key questions from it. And then the interview, for the most part, is about them. And that's kind of what interview based is. Like, you come on my podcast, we're going to talk about you and what you're doing, and hopefully my guests will want to connect with you. Nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of good podcasts I listen to that are interview based. And like I said, I did it for a while. One of my favorite podcasts is the Carey Nieuwhof podcast, which he has leaders on all the time, and they talk about what they do and they tie it into leadership. And so, but for me personally, being that I was basically a one-man team, and between editing and scheduling and all that stuff, the interviews just got kind of overwhelming. And so I just kind of laid it before God, like, what do you want this to be? Like, I can continue with this, but I'm kind of getting burned out. And so, I don't know when it was, January I reached out to you, or December.
December. I think it was December, but we really got into talking more about it in January. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm like, hey, I noticed you had stopped your podcast around the same time, I think.
Right.
And then I'm like, oh, so what are your plans? And then I reached out to you, and you're like, I don't really know either. And I'll have you tell that part. But then that's kind of how we connected with this joint venture.
Yeah, it's really fantastic how it all worked out. For me, I didn't really know what my podcast was. Like I was kind of new to the whole thing. I've done podcasting before, but the last podcast I did was a sports podcast, and that's a totally different. I mean, it's just entirely different because it's just your opinions about what's happening. And there's really no way to be right and wrong, because it's just like, hey, either Michael Jordan's the greatest or LeBron's the greatest, and you can argue all day about it.
Yeah.
But with my podcast, Hope After Hurt, that I was doing, there were specific moments in my life that I wanted to expose, because I felt like more and more what I was learning is the reason people weren't going to church is because they had been hurt by the church or they had been hurt by other people. Very rarely was it like an actual perspective of I've been hurt by God. And I was trying to shed some light on how important it is for us to be in community, and that I've been there too, that I've been hurt by people, I've been hurt by leaders, I've been in difficult situations and all that stuff, and hopefully bringing hope after the hurt. That was the whole concept. But then like I got 10 episodes in and I'm like, all right, this is a cool concept, but kind of like you, like, all right, I'm creating the content. I only have so many stories, and now do I revamp and do I go a totally different direction? And I have this group of listeners that I'm trying to encourage and trying to do that through social media. But at the same time that's happening, like I'm not very like savvy on social media. And it's not that it's really not that I can't learn. It's that I just don't want to. I've looked into it and I'm like, yeah, I get that I could watch this video and learn how to, do a TikTok and edit things, but I'm just like, I'm just not into it. And it's just not a passion of mine. It takes so much energy. And I actually was starting to compliment you on how great you were at those things. And it was then in our conversation that we realized, wow, like we might really balance each other here in what takes energy away from somebody, what adds energy to somebody else. And really for me too, having you on my podcast, there are some people that you dialogue with that, right off the bat, you connect well and you banter well and all that stuff. And there's, that's kind of the showmanship of the podcast. Right. But so much deeper than that. And I feel so much more important than that is when I was speaking with you, what I loved is I was like, I think this is somebody I can learn from. I think this is somebody that can help me understand some things in my own life. This is somebody that can help me understand some things in my position in ministry. And I have just always been captivated and wanting to be around people that I can grow in, learn from, and ask questions to, and really dive in. So I just can't believe that it worked out the way it did. It's one of those only God kind of things, because even just the way we connected, the way we found each other, the way we went on each other's podcast, and then, a year or so later are still talking and now doing this is really, really cool. I am curious about something though. You mentioned how grueling it is to have the interview podcast. All right. Yeah. Do you have a person that you were like, he was definitely the easiest to interview? I also wondered, do you have somebody that you're like the most grueling episode or the hardest person to interview? Like, I just wonder if you have some experience on both sides of the extremes.
Yeah. It's funny because when you meet someone for the first time, 5 minutes before you go on air with them, you don't have a lot of time to get to know them. And so you rely on their work, you rely on what you've heard about them maybe. And there were definitely some duds where it may not have come across in the interview, but I could tell that I was like reaching for straws to try to keep the conversation going. And that's one of the pains of interview based with someone new every week, is that you're reliant upon the fact that this person may not work out. And the good thing is I've never had to like not air something. I've cut out pieces, but I've never not aired an interview because it was such a disaster. So that's the good news, I guess. From what I would say is some of the people that you would not think, like some of the quote lower names that aren't as big of a platform, or some of the easiest to talk to, because they were just casual, like good guys like yourself, that came on and just like could have talked for another 3 or 4 episodes with them. There was one guy, Dr. Sam, that came on, and he's a heart doctor and he wrote a book, and he was just like the most energetic. Like I felt so pumped after talking to him, and had never met him before. And that was just one example. Now the other side there, I won't name names, but there are people that came on and it was so hard to keep up with them. Well, either keep up with them. There was one person that was just like asleep almost, and I won't name his name, but Someone like Bob Goff, for example, just was so like he's on a level 20 always.
Yeah.
Just the way he talks and the way he, always like, squirrel, next topic. And so when I'm trying to like keep him focused on the interview questions, like he wanted to go on a completely different trajectory. And so that was hard to keep up.
I bet.
Also, Michael, what's the comedian that I had on? Michael, I can't even think of his name now. Christian comedian. Anyway, he was.
I know who you're talking about.
Yeah.
I can't think of his name.
Yeah, I know. I was blanking on his last name.
But it is Michael.
I have his book behind me. But anyway, a comedian to try to keep up with him on interview is like, he's always trying to find a punchline for stuff, And
right.
So trying to keep up with that when I'm like, I have my 10 questions I got to ask you. Now you want to go off on a random story, So it was more of a challenge for me as an interviewer. Not necessarily anything bad about those people, but that's just one of the things about that interview based thing. And when we talked on the phone, like we talked for an hour, and then we're like, this could have been a podcast episode.
We totally did.
Like everything we said, I think people might want to hear because it was interesting.
Right. For sure. Hopefully we can like reenact that.
Right? I know that's
we
the
can
goal.
Just keep that going.
That's the goal. And so when we talked about this podcast, we talked about going forward with, we talked a lot about names, and it was funny because we even had ChatGPT come up with like 10 possible names,
and they were good. They weren't bad names at all, which is really frightening. And I do think at some point we've got to do some kind of just breakdown of ChatGPT and really where this is headed and what we see.
That'll be an episode. That'll be fun.
That'll 100% be an episode.
And so we talked about all these different names, like two pastors drinking coffee, or I don't know, they were weird names. And actually some of the good ones were already taken. And so then we talked about, what about Discerning Dad, since that's kind of like my ministry name. And then, what about Eyes on Jesus, since that's already the name. We can keep the podcast, this podcast server up, and then people that are already subscribed will see like, a new podcast, new cover art, and a new title. So that's what we did. That's why it's Eyes on Jesus with Drew and Tim, because we still want, no matter what nonsense we talk about, we still want it at the end of the episode, we want the focus to be on Jesus. And so we'll talk about life updates, we'll talk about ChatGPT, we'll talk about random stuff, but at the same time, how does it pertain to your life? How does it pertain to maybe one or two takeaways that you can have that say, that makes me think a little bit. We might have something more specifically for ministry leaders. We might have something specifically more for parenting, or marriage. I mean, there's a lot of topics we can do. And instead of like pigeonholing the interviews or the podcast to be just under one topic, Eyes on Jesus is a nice umbrella that covers life, right?
Yeah, I think that's so key. You just look at, you look at this week, there's so many things happening, and we're busy guys. We got a lot going on. Like you mentioned, like we're dads, we're husbands, we're ministry leaders, we're pastors, we're pulled in all these different directions at the same time. Like we're still trying to accomplish some things personally, that are geared towards leadership, that are geared towards our own walk of faith. And then also like, are we going to the gym? Are we working out? Like there's all these like little things that we're involved in. So I think having a nice general umbrella is good. It allows us also to like react to some things in a really proactive way in what's going on in the world, and how we can really keep our eyes on Jesus in some of our most difficult moments. And I think that that's really valuable. I think that's important. And it allows us to hopefully what this podcast is set out to do, which is whatever you're going through during the week, find a connection point with us in it, and then acknowledge each other like, hey, I have empathy for what you're walking through, have empathy for what we're walking through. And then together, let's understand that there's a common goal here. And the common goal is not to make this about us and not to, get down in our feelings, but to really walk out in obedience and keep our eyes on Jesus and make sure that we can move forward together. And so ultimately, the hope is that as fun as this is and as great as this is, and really what I feel and believe God has brought together, and I think is going to be really impactful. Really the thought is that we would all grow together. Yeah. And what a wonderful, wonderful thing to be in a position to do that in community, whether it's listening to this in the car or listening to this, at your home or wherever you might be. So I'm honestly excited, but I'm so expectant as well to hear from people about what God's doing through this podcast. It's going to be great.
Yeah. And this is good for us to kind of talk and to get our thoughts out to each other and bounce ideas off each other. Like, this podcast is for us as much as it's for you. Like, we're not perfect. Don't ever look at us. Oh, these are pastors, I need to model my life after them. I mean, maybe there's some things we say that is wisdom from God that you can grow with, but also, like, this is literally like conversation, like two friends hanging out, having coffee and just talking about life and the challenges we face, the struggles we face, things that we think about in a different way that we can be like, oh, I never thought about it that way before. And so that's why inviting you along, and the conversation would have been a good podcast name, but Adam Weber has it, and it's actually a really good podcast. So I'll let him have that. But
shout out. So
Weber. Ours is the conversation with us as we keep our eyes on Jesus. And so with that, as our community of people who follow this, like we want to hear from you. And so if there's topics that you want us to cover, just email us. It'll be in the show notes on how to get a hold of us. But we really want this to not just be an outward focused podcast on just what we have to say because we're these experts, but really just diving into, like, what is our community dealing with? Like, I had a really rough week dealing with this. Like, what are your thoughts? Like, oh, well, I've never faced that, but the Bible says this, or I really struggled with this, but God brought us through. Like, there might be some really good opportunities for us to express those types of opinions on topics.
Exactly. And this is what's so wonderful about our faith is it is the only religion that celebrates everyone being in process.
Right. Yeah.
This is what is so wonderful about Christianity. This is what is so wonderful about our Jesus, is that there's not some expectation of perfection or some expectation that you get it all figured out or some expectation that we have it figured out and we're trying to tell you because we're pastors. Like, none of that. This is what's so great, is that we all get to sit here and say, hey, we're at different places in the process because of our past, because of our experiences, because of our emotions, because of the way we're wired, because of our genetics, because of what we went through, and the family we grew up in and the friends we have. Because of all of those things, we all look at things differently, speak about things differently, view things differently, and we're all at different points in the process, and it looks differently for each of us. But that relationship with Christ, that keeping your eyes on Jesus, that keeping him as the focus, that is the commonality that allows us to all enter into this and go, yep, me too. This is how we can grow together. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. So that's the introduction we have for you today. And we just encourage you to subscribe and to share this and be excited with us, because we're hopeful of what God's going to do with this platform, and not to build our kingdom, but to build his, and to help you keep your eyes on Jesus. And so next week, we plan to talk about fitness on multiple levels, spiritual and physical fitness. And so please join us for that. So until next time, this is Drew and Tim. Go with God, grow in discernment, and keep your eyes on Jesus.